Hello, everyone. This is a reading of the book Elizabeth Started All the Trouble, and it was written by Doreen Rappaport and illustrated by Matt Faulkner. And this is a wonderfully illustrated book in honor of Women's History Month. I hope you enjoy it. Over 235 years ago, Abigail Adams got a letter from her husband. John was in Philadelphia in a big room with lots of other men. The colonists had declared independence from Great Britain and were busy writing new laws for the new nation. Abigail was ecstatic. She wanted independence as much as John did, but she was worried. Would women be included in the new laws? She warned John that if women were not remembered, they would start their own revolution. John laughed at her. It took much longer than Abigail wanted for that revolution to begin, but it finally started 72 years later. And here's Abigail Adams saying, "Remember the ladies." In 1840, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott and their husbands traveled 3,000 miles across the ocean to London. They were meeting people from all over the world who were working as hard as they were to end slavery. When they got to the meeting, Elizabeth and Lucretia found out that they were not allowed to be delegates. In fact, if women wanted to be there just to listen to the men speak, they had to sit behind a curtain so they couldn't be seen. Elizabeth and Lucretia were shocked. How could men who were against slavery deny women their rights just because they were women? They had to do something to change this. Well, it took much longer than they would have liked, but on July 13th, 1848, Lucretia and Elizabeth met with 3 friends to plan a meeting in Seneca Falls, New York, to discuss women's rights. These women knew they needed to write some kind of declaration so people would understand what they wanted. But what should they write? Elizabeth read aloud from Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The women agreed that it was a great document as far as it went, but Jefferson had left out some very important things. Elizabeth said she would rewrite it. She did, and she gave it a new name, the Declaration of Sentiments. The women planned a 2-day convention to begin 6 days later. They put a notice about the meeting in a local newspaper. At that time of the year, in upstate New York, most women were very busy on their farms. The planners didn't think many would come. They were wrong about that. 300 women came from far and near, by horse, by wagon. Some even walked. The convention had been planned for just women, but when 40 men showed up on the first day, the women let them in. The women didn't feel confident enough to lead the meeting. In those days, it wasn't considered, quote, proper for women to lead meetings if men were present. They asked Lucretia's husband James to do it. For 2 days, things went along smoothly as one person after another made speeches. Elizabeth read and reread her declaration, paragraph by paragraph, and people discussed what she had written. Like the male colonists who had listed their grievances against the King of Great Britain, Elizabeth listed all the unfair laws against women written by men. It was a very long list. It was unfair that women couldn't go to college or become doctors or lawyers or ministers. It was unfair that women could not keep property they inherited. It was unfair that women had to give any money they earned to their husbands. Everyone agreed. No one could deny it. Everything Elizabeth said was true. But there was lots of debate over Elizabeth's sentiment that women deserve the right to vote, and it was their sacred duty to get it. The idea of women voting was too daring for most people at the convention, including many women. Out of 300 people, only 68 women and 32 men signed their names to Elizabeth's declaration. Elizabeth's husband didn't sign. He had left town when she told him what she was planning to say. When Elizabeth's father heard what she had said, he rushed up to see if his daughter was insane. That's when the big trouble started. It had taken 72 years, but just like Abigail had predicted, Elizabeth's declaration started a revolution. And her paper says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." Ministers, all men of course, spoke out against her ideas. Women belong at home. Newspapers, all men of course, wrote what they thought about Elizabeth's declaration. The lawmakers, all men of course, laughed. Women certainly do not belong in the voting booth. Elizabeth wasn't surprised that her idea shocked so many people. Neither was Lucretia, but they knew it was going to be a long, hard fight before women won equality. But Elizabeth had no doubt they would succeed. With so many newspapers all over the country reporting on the Seneca Falls Convention, word spread about Elizabeth's ideas. Lots of women agreed with her. Meetings popped up in towns and cities in the North and Midwest. 1,000 women came to the first National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1850. Sojourner Truth, who had escaped from slavery, went to a meeting in Ohio. She caused quite a stir when she reminded white women there that black women were treated even worse than they were. "That man over there says women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches, and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman?" In the spring of 1851, a 31-year-old schoolteacher named Susan B. Anthony visited Elizabeth. The two women became fast friends. They traveled everywhere and made lots of speeches together. But after a while, it became too hard for Elizabeth to travel. She had to stay home and bake and cook and wash and sew and care for her children and her husband. Susan B., who was single, went anywhere and everywhere. The other women hit the lecture trail too. And some of these women are Sarah Grimke, Antoinette Brown, Ernestine Rose, Lucy Stone, Angelina Grimke, Frances Gage, Paulina Davis, Abby Kelly Foster, Frances Harper. And there's Susan B. Anthony. The Suffrage Express. Suffrage means voting rights. Soon women started doing what men and even some women called unladylike things. Amelia Bloomer promoted new, comfortable clothing for women. Women could hardly breathe or move Women could hardly breathe or move before in their tight-laced long dresses with heavy petticoats underneath. Some petticoats weighed as much as 14 pounds. And if Amelia's clothing wasn't unladylike enough, Mary Lyon opened a, quote, female seminary known today as Mount Holyoke, I don't know how to say that, College. The women studied science and mathematics, geography, rhetoric, philosophy, astronomy, ancient and modern history, subjects that men studied in their colleges. So it's basically like a women's college. And I wanted to read this quote. This man says, "Women should not dress like men." Two sisters, Elizabeth and Emily Blackwell, became doctors. When no hospital would hire them, they set up their own clinic for women and children and a medical school for women. Antoinette Brown became a minister and preached in church. And then there was Lucy Stone, At her marriage ceremony to Henry Blackwell, one of Elizabeth and Emily's brothers, she refused to say she would, quote, obey her husband. Henry agreed, and Lucy kept her name after they were married. And they both said, "We believe a marriage should be an equal partnership." In snow, in rain, in hail, the suffragists traveled everywhere. And it says suffragist is a name for a woman who fought for the vote. They gave speeches during blizzards, and more times than not, they were booed and mocked by men and women too. But their hard work and dedication helped. In Massachusetts and New York, married women finally gained the right to own property and keep whatever money they earned. But no matter how many people the suffragists talked to, and no matter how many petitions they got signed, and no matter how hard they worked to win the right to vote, the lawmakers still refused to change the law. By April 1861, the issue of slavery split the country and led to a civil war between the North and the South. Women on both sides of the conflict worked for the war effort, doing more, quote, unladylike things. They prepared and delivered supplies to the soldiers. They lived in tents on the battlefield and fed and nursed the wounded. Some women became spies. A few women even dressed as men and fought in the battle. And I'm going to show you these women's names. This is Rose Greenhow, Confederate spy. This is Sarah Edmonds, a Union soldier, and there's a really amazing book called Nurse, Soldier, Spy about Sarah Edmonds. This is Susie King. She was a Union nurse. Phoebe Pember, Confederate nurse. Pauline Cushman, Union spy. Loretta Velasquez, Confederate soldier. Belle Boyd, Confederate spy. Clara Barton, a Union nurse. Sarah Wakeman, a Union soldier. And Sally Tompkins, a Confederate nurse. On January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It freed over 3 million black men, women, and children in slavery, but it did not free enslaved African Americans everywhere in the United States. When the North won the war, the suffragists set out to change that. They held meetings and started a letter-writing campaign. They collected more than 400,000 signatures in support of abolition. Abolition is the abolishing of slavery. On January 31st, 1865, the U.S. Congress passed the 13th Amendment, ending slavery everywhere in the United States. Then the lawmakers began debating giving the vote to black men. Now, Elizabeth thought, now is our chance to get the vote too. But they didn't. So the suffragists kept on traveling and making speeches. Susan B. racked up the most speeches, more than 75 each year for 45 years. Even people who opposed women voting agreed that Lucy Stone, too, was an exceptionally great speaker. But the lawmakers didn't listen. Sojourner tried to vote in Battle Creek, Michigan, and was turned away. Susan B. was arrested and fined. And when she went to the polls in Rochester, New York, she refused to pay. Then, hooray for Wyoming! In 1869, women won the right to vote there. Next in Kansas, and then Colorado, Utah, and Idaho, and then in Washington, California, which was in 1911, Arizona, and Oregon. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. and Lucy Stone and Lucretia and Sojourner grew old and died. New women continued the fight. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns were fed up. 69 years had passed since Elizabeth read her declaration, and women could vote in only 9 states. No more speeches, Lucy said. No more trying to win over male lawmakers. It was time to do something different to get attention. So the suffragists held a parade. On March 3rd, 1913, a day before President Wilson's inauguration, 8,000 women marched down the streets of Washington, D.C. Following them were 26 floats, 10 bands, 4 mounted brigades, 3 heralds, and 6 chariots. Angry spectators shouted ugly names and shoved them. Soldiers had to be called in to stop the attacks. Even people who didn't believe that men should be allowed to vote were outraged. That women should not be allowed to vote, were outraged at the treatment of the marchers. The suffragists kept on marching and talking to lawmakers. More lawmakers listened. Hooray for Montana and Nevada, 1914. And hooray for New York, 1917. Hooray for Michigan, South Dakota, and Oklahoma in 1918. On January 10th, 1917, the suffragists started picketing in front of the White House. In rain, in snow, in blistering heat, they stood silently with their signs. Angry mobs attacked them. The police did nothing to protect them, nor did they arrest any of their attackers. In the next 11 months, more than 200 women were arrested for picketing. Almost 100 women served time in prison. Alice Paul was sentenced to 7 months and thrown into solitary confinement for 2 weeks with nothing to eat but bread and water. Lucy Burns and 40 other women were beaten. Other suffragists took their places in front of the White House. Newspapers wrote about the brutal treatment of the women. Support for their cause grew. A judge finally ruled that the arrests were unconstitutional and ordered the women freed. A year after the women started picketing, President Wilson declared his support for an amendment to the Constitution giving women the right to vote. On August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote became law. Lawmakers had finally done what Abigail Adams wanted the Founding Fathers to do in that big room in Philadelphia so long ago. The women had triumphed after battling for the vote for 72 years, but they knew their work was not over. There were still many unfair laws to change so that women could have true equality with men, and we're still working on it. And some of the women in the front row here are famous women's rights activists or politicians or lawmakers. You might notice Sonia Sotomayor, the Supreme Court Justice, and Hillary Clinton, the former First Lady and presidential candidate. It's a wonderful picture. Here's Billie Jean King. She was a tennis star. Anyway, let's continue. That's the end of the story. I highly check out reading about these women, and I may read a few stories about them. There's a wonderful book I love about Sojourner Truth. So stay tuned for our library website. I'll be adding more biographies.